Ooh, applause. Bonjour tout le monde et merci beaucoup. Et as I always say, désolé pour mon français, je suis américain, mais maintenant je suis aussi canadien, so I have no excuse. Okay, so this will be en anglais. I'm going to talk a bit about this book that I wrote, came out last summer. It's called MP3, The Meaning of a Format. If you Google those words at the top of the slide, you can read the introduction for free on Scribd, or Scribed, or whatever it's called. So that's an easy way to get access to the material, whether you want to purchase the fetishizable commodity or not. I'm going to do things a little bit differently, too, because you've all been sort of sitting patiently and listening. There will be some listening, but there will also be some talking, because you're right. I mean, the book's like 350 pages or something, and so there's an awful lot in there, and I have no idea what the people in this room in particular are interested in. So I'm going to give you a little overview. Then we're going to do an exercise. I am a university professor. And then we're going to have a discussion. And so it's basically mostly Q&A with a little bit of priming at the beginning. So actually, these numbers are probably not true anymore, but they were true when I wrote them several years ago. But let's just go with it. So there's about 10 million people, probably more now, sharing MP3 files online. So that means about 18 billion MP3 files are shared each year, and this is only a small measurable portion of the traffic. Now, if you think about this, this dwarfs the output of the official recording industry by several orders of magnitude, right? So there is, the way I like to put it is that there are more MP3s in circulation than there are all other forms of recording in world history combined. So you're talking about a huge sort of change in the magnitude of sound recordings in the book. A few other statistics. Digital sales the year before last, I don't have last year's numbers, were $4.6 billion of just under $16 billion total. And something like 2/3 of internet traffic is peer-to-peer file sharing, right? So we're talking about huge amounts of resources being used to circulate recordings. So what is an MP3 and why do I care? An MP3 is a file format and a standard. And in my business, when people write histories of communication technology, they generally talk about media. And we think about media, I mean, if you go and look at textbooks, why would you want to? You wouldn't. And you look at the textbooks, they divide media history or media studies into media. So today we'll talk about print, and tomorrow we'll talk about television, and then we'll talk about radio, and then we'll talk about cinema, and on and on and on. But what's interesting is that may have been a kind of historical blip, sort of accident of the mechanical age from, say, the mid-19th to the late 20th century, because the important historical technological change now seems to be occurring at levels either above or below media. So something like a file format could be actually much more important than a sort of set-top box with a receiver and a screen, or conversely, it might be the infrastructure that no end user ever directly encounters, but that becomes the very important thing for understanding how media systems work, right? What are these devices without broadband? They're very, very expensive Walkman and video game players. So I got interested in MP3s as a file format and as a standard, which is this sort of weird register of technological history. MP3 is a proprietary format, so even though it's shared all over the world, it's not open source or open access. I don't know. Are you guys familiar with those terms? Yeah, okay. It's not open source or open access. It's owned by, the patents are owned by a consortium of companies. The people who own the most are Fraunhofer, which is a German consortium. AT&T, now Lucent, owns some, and also France Telecom and Thomson. And the patents are worth about 100 million euros a year. Now, who pays for these? Well, it's not us, the end users. In fact, if you are making less than $100,000 a year on whatever technology you're using to circulate MP3s, you don't have to pay a fee. But who does? The list of licensees reads like a who's who of new media distribution. So you'd see names you'd expect, like Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, and Motorola. But there are other kinds of names in there. Airbus, airplane company, CNN, Focus on the Family, which is like this sort of Christian conglomerate in the United States, and Mattel, who make toys. So MP3, in addition to all its normal, what we would think of as media niches, has its place in air travel, news, toys, and evangelical Christianity. Now, I got interested in MP3s for a sort of geeky reason. When people write about them, generally the two things you hear about, like if you see MP3 in the news, two things that you're likely to encounter. One is people concerned about file sharing and the future of the music industry and profitability and things like that, or people freaking out about sound quality, or talking about how they like tapes or vinyl better or something like that, right? Those are the two places that you encounter it. And I do talk about file sharing, and I do talk about sound quality issues, though not necessarily in the ways you might expect in the book. But that's not the real reason I was interested in the MP3. The real reason, so there's you can see at the bottom of the slide, there's a diagram of how music becomes an MP3. And to make a very complicated thing a very simple explanation, basically it does two things. An MP3, the reason why MP3s are useful or interesting is because an average MP3 of a recording, let's say a song on a pop CD, is about 12% the size of the original song on your CD, right? So you can cram more of them onto your hard drive, not mine, obviously. You can, it's cheaper to send them down a phone line or across a network. And you can stockpile a whole lot more of them, right? So the small size is actually incredibly useful in a context where, well, in the 1980s and 90s when they were designing the format, storage was expensive. Now storage is cheap, but bandwidth is still expensive. In fact, it's one of the most valuable commodities you can have in the new media environment. If you're selling bandwidth, it's basically a license to print money right now. So the whole thing is you got to make it smaller. Now, how are you going to make it smaller? There's two ways to make an audio file smaller. The first is something that engineers call lossless compression, and there's a whole sort of, I don't know, I hesitate to use the word ontology, but like theory of reality in the words I'm about to give you. And I don't actually believe this theory, but this is the engineering nomenclature, so we're going to go with it because it means something to other people and it's a useful distinction. So there's two things you can do. The first is what's called lossless compression. And lossless compression is basically like when you have overpacked for a trip and so you press all the air out of your clothes and roll them up really tight. I've been all over the world. I cannot pack light, so this is actually an example from my life. This is called lossless compression. With digital files, basically what you're doing is creating shortcuts, numbered trees, and getting rid of redundant data so that the most often accessed data are most readily available to the computer. And the technique's very old. The most common letters in Morse code have the simplest, shortest the simplest, shortest ciphers. So, a dot or a dash, as opposed to a series of dots or dashes, is reserved for the letters that occur most frequently in everyday writing, like the letter A or the letter S or something like that. So it's an old principle. It's a 19th century principle, but that was abstracted into math and information theory through the work of people like Claude Shannon, who's a famous mathematician, and also invented the idea of the bit, which is, of course, also very important for computers. So MP3s are, a pretty banal creature of digital history if you're just looking at the lossless compression. The interesting thing is the second part, which is the lossy compression, which is basically you don't really need that anyway, is the approach. the technique's called perceptual coding, and what it does is they take a mathematical model of the gaps and absences in the human ear, in human hearing, and say, well, what parts of the signal aren't you going to hear anyway? And if you're not going to hear it, why don't we just not ever keep it? Why don't we get rid of it? So if you're not going to hear certain frequencies, and there are a whole set of sort of psychoacoustic theories as to what we do and don't hear and why, then we'll get rid of those things. We'll use this mathematical model from second to second to compare what's going on in the music in the recording to that model. We'll pull the frequencies out that we don't need, and we'll produce a much, much smaller file. So Huffman coding gets you about 50% size savings, and then the rest is the perceptual coding. And that was really the big technical innovation that made MP3s possible. There's another math innovation that the engineers are all super excited about, but I'm not going to talk about it. It's called the modified discrete cosine transform. And I can't do it for you. And I don't have an interesting cultural historical story about it, so we're going to ignore it. And instead, we're going to talk about perceptual coding. But it's there, and if you're a geek, it's very important. So the thing I'm interested in is this perceptual model. So you can see there's all sorts of things you do to audio to turn it from CD audio to MP3 audio. But this thing in the upper left-hand corner, this perceptual model, what is it? Where does it come from? Why did they, what is that listening subject? And specifically, what is that listening subject with all the holes in it that's hiding out in this standard? And what is its connection to the history of technology, the history of hearing, what it means even to be a person in our contemporary technical world? That's basically what the book's about, and that's what I was interested in. And so everything else comes from that. Now, I'm going to give you just a couple sort of extremely broad, and everything I'm about to say, actually everything I've already said, just pretend it begins with, it is a tremendous generalization to say that, and then whatever comes after is what I'm actually saying. But so let's go forward. So when people talk about the history of communication technology, they generally talk about increased definition. So people say it's ironic, we get better and better digital technologies, higher resolution, and then we get these crappy MP3s, even though in fact many people in practice cannot tell the difference between the MP3 and the CD version of the same recording. They say, well, we're getting these, crappy sounds even though we have all this sort of technical progress. What's going on? And what's going on is that what you think is a paradox isn't a paradox. The story we are most often told about sort of the aesthetic significance of technical innovation is that we get greater and greater reality or realism from our media. And by reality and realism, people usually mean something much more technical, which is definition, right? So it's like the number of pixels on the screen, the number of possible steps between the quietest and loudest part of the sound, and so on and so forth. So I call this way of talking about the history of communication technology the general history of verisimilitude. Verisimilitude actually is similarity to truth, or in the words of the philosopher Stephen Colbert, truthiness. So the general history of verisimilitude says, with each technical change, what we see is progress towards greater definition. This definition stands in for fidelity to a source, even though it's not the same thing. And the sound theorist and filmmaker Michel Chion makes a great point about this in Audio Visions, where he says, think about a conversation in a movie where one character is talking to another, and then they turn away from you and walk away, and their voice retains its super crisp high end, right? That's realism in the movies. But if you were in the room and a person turned around from you and walked away, their voice would lose all the high end, because high frequencies are directional, right? So when we talk about realism in media, we're actually talking about something much closer to hyperrealism. And with these things, right? I mean, the other story you hear is, well, people no longer pay attention to music. They used to, but they don't anymore, right? There's this idea that there's this model or ideal subject of these high-definition media, someone who's immersed, engrossed, contemplating, or in the language of film theory, sutured. So that's one story you can tell about the history of communication technology, and it's a good story, and it's great for selling new stuff. Look, new product, more reality. Buy it.